So how do you create a class of billionaires basically overnight? Well, in the 1990s, Russia kind of wrote the playbook. It's an incredible story of chaos, corruption, and a radical economic experiment that really truly forged the nation we see today. Let's break down how it all went down.
You have to understand, for most Russians, the fall of the Soviet Union wasn't this bright new capitalist future. It's remembered as the wild 90s. It was a time of such deep national trauma that they actually mashed up the word catastrophe with perestroika to coin a new term, katastroika. This wasn't just a transition, it felt like a national disaster.
And right at the heart of this disaster was a process that the public, well, they didn't call it privatization, they called it privatizatia. It's a cynical play on words that basically means to grab or to seize. It got known as privatization because to millions of people, that's exactly what it felt like, a mass fraud, a heist of the entire country's wealth. So that brings us to the big question for this explainer. How, exactly, was the wealth of a global superpower stolen right out in the open? And what does that heist mean for the Russia we see today? Okay, so to really get the heist, you first have to understand the collapse. The Soviet Union wasn't just having a political crisis, it was having a financial one. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the country was completely bankrupt. This system was just fundamentally broken. The Central Planning Committee, Gazplan, was totally overwhelmed, which led to these chronic shortages of, well, everything. Soap, shoes, you name it. The economy couldn't innovate, and the whole thing was being propped up almost entirely by high oil prices. So when those oil prices crashed in the 1980s, it wasn't just a shock, it was a fatal blow to an already dying system. Into this total chaos steps a new government with a pretty radical plan, one that was heavily influenced by Western advisors. They called it shock therapy, and it was designed to basically jolt Russia into a market economy overnight. The mantra, which was pushed by big players like the IMF and the US Treasury, was brutally simple: stabilize the currency, privatize all the state assets, and liberalize prices. The guy who designed this plan, Yegor Gaidar, he genuinely believed this was the only way to avoid total collapse and famine. But here's where the whole story gets messy right from the very beginning. The top American advisors, this team from Harvard, were supposed to be building a fair, transparent system, but instead, they got caught using their insider knowledge to make their own personal investments in the exact markets they were creating. And the fallout was huge. Harvard was eventually forced to pay a record-breaking $26.5 million settlement to the US government. So you see, this wasn't some tiny ethical slip-up. It was a major scandal that showed the privatization of Russia had foreign fingerprints on it from day one. So with that compromised foundation, the great property heist began. It basically unfolded in two distinct phases, both designed to rapidly move the entire nation's wealth into private hands. It all started with something called Voucher Privatization, which gave this illusion that every citizen was about to become an owner. But the real masterstroke, the main event, was the Loans-for-Shares scheme. That's where the crown jewels of the Soviet economy were really seized. Okay, so in phase one, every single Russian citizen gets a piece of paper, a voucher, which was theoretically their share in the national wealth. But think about it. In a country with zero capitalist culture, facing insane hyperinflation, these things seemed worthless. Most people, desperate for cash, sold them for pennies on the dollar, sometimes literally for a bottle of vodka, to the old Soviet factory managers, the so-called Red Directors, who knew exactly what these vouchers were really worth.
And that set the stage perfectly for phase two. By 1996, President Boris Yeltsin's approval rating was in the single digits. So to make sure he got re-elected and to stop a return to communism, a deal was struck. A small group of bankers loaned the government money, and in return, they got shares in Russia's most valuable companies. We're talking oil, gas, and metals as so-called collateral.
The result was a series of completely sham auctions. The government, just as planned, defaulted on the loans. And the bankers, who were running the auctions themselves, by the way, sold these incredible assets to their own companies for absurdly low prices. You can see the scale of it right here. Yukos, a massive oil giant. Sibneft, with its huge oil fields. Norilsk Nickel, a global metals behemoth. All of them acquired for just a tiny fraction of their actual worth.
And just to put a fine point on it, Mikhail Khodorkovsky got a controlling stake in the oil giant Yukos, a company valued at about $5 billion for just $310 million. This wasn't a sale, it was literally the birth of the oligarchs, all written down and codified into law. So while a handful of guys became billionaires, what was the price for everybody else? This brings us to the absolutely devastating human cost of the Kotraustrika.
The second that price controls were lifted, inflation exploded to over 2,500%. In an instant, the life savings of an entire population, grandmothers, doctors, factory workers, you name it, were just gone, rendered completely worthless overnight.
The shock to the system was so profound it actually triggered a demographic collapse that was totally unprecedented in a modern industrialized nation not at war. In just 4 years, male life expectancy plummeted by over 5 years. This was driven by stress, alcoholism, terrible nutrition, and a healthcare system that was just falling apart.
And of course, inequality just skyrocketed. Russia's Gini coefficient, which is a standard way to measure inequality, it just exploded. In less than a decade, a society that had been, by this measure, pretty equitable, transformed into one with the same levels of inequality you'd see in Brazil or Mexico.
So, what's the lasting legacy of all this? Well, the wild 90s weren't just some chaotic chapter in Russian history. They are the very foundation of the system that's in place today.
You can draw a straight line. In '96, the oligarchs basically bought an election. But by 2003, a new leader, Vladimir Putin, he sets new rules by jailing the country's richest man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, and seizing his company. The message was crystal clear. Your wealth exists only at the Kremlin's pleasure. And this system, born from a heist, is the very same one now directing a wartime economy.
This created a fundamental shift in power. In the 1990s, the oligarchs controlled the state. Under Putin, the state controls the oligarchs. They got to keep their ill-gotten gains, sure, but only as long as they stayed completely out of politics. The ownership model stayed the same, but the ultimate authority changed hands. And the ripples from the 90s are now Russia's biggest economic headaches. That demographic collapse from back then has created a severe labor shortage today. The economy is still way too dependent on state spending, which is now all going to the military, and long-term growth is forecast to pretty much stagnate. The wild 90s cast a very, very long shadow.
Which leaves us with a final, really crucial thought. The privatization of the 1990s wasn't a failed transition to capitalism. It was actually a very successful transfer of property that created the exact system Russia has today. Its foundations are built on this heist. So the question is, what, if anything, could ever truly change it?